welcome to CrossView Radio podcast for Wayne County. I'm John Marino, pastor of CrossView Church Norville. We exist to glorify God by exalting Christ and magnifying the gospel for the joy of all nations. Okay, this is the third week on the topic of trauma, and like I told you last week, we'll be looking at the symptoms today. And I'd like to remind you of something that I said when we first started the series, and that is that I am attempting to communicate with four different groups of people. Among those who have experienced genuine hurt, there are those who are responding well to that, and there are those who are responding poorly. And among those who have not experienced genuine hurt, there are those who are responding well and those who are responding poorly. Today's symptoms will not apply to every category, but it must be recognized that they are, at a minimum, temptations for everyone. And so listen carefully and see if any of these apply. And one more thing. It has to be restated that the current edition of the prevailing doctrine of our day is that victims can do no wrong. The very fact that I am suggesting that traumatized persons may need to correct their behavior in some way is highly offensive. Understand that if you react to correction by becoming offended, you cut yourself off from all hope of a cure. It ought to be no more offensive to tell trauma victims that they need to guard themselves against bitterness than it is to tell burn victims that they need to apply burn cream to their wounds. All right, let's jump in. And as I mentioned, if you're not struggling with any of these, then understand that these are temptations that you may be particularly prone to. The first symptom of trauma is self-isolation. This one should be fairly obvious. You have been burned in the past, and so you want to avoid getting burned again. Getting too close to other people comes with risks, and so you need to minimize that risk. Oftentimes, you see this with people who are diagnosed with PTSD, and by the way, I'm going to come back to that label of PTSD later. Sometimes, those who have had a traumatic experience in the past have an oversensitive fight or flight switch, and so they might get aggressive when they shouldn't, or they may withdraw when they shouldn't and become passive. There's a term that some people use for this called avoidance, but in any event, this is not a biblical response. Proverbs 18:1 reminds us, "Whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment." Isolating yourself will only lead to your own future unhappiness. Avoiding church will lead to your own future unhappiness. You are trying to cure yourself with poison. The antidote to a bad church is a good church, not no church. The antidote to a bad relationship is a good one, not no relationships. It's also important to understand and to note that this particular symptom goes hand in hand with the modern virtue of individualism. Oftentimes, those who've experienced trauma will leave a church that leans into community for a church that leans into expressive individualism. Think of the individual who maybe experiences some sort of church hurt. They're possibly on the road to deconstruction, but there's still a strong enough remaining impulse to be committed to a church, so they leave their bad church to try to find another one. What kind of church is this person going to be drawn to? Many times, they're going to be drawn to the very large, program-driven, therapeutic-laced church that's happy to give them lots of space and not ask any questions. This individual can sometimes even become highly evangelistic about their particular church, expressing it as a breath of fresh air. The sermon applications are highly individualistic. Everything overemphasizes your relationship with God personally. Everything is between you and God, and the church just facilitates that. And this is important to note here. In this particular church model, the purpose of the church is only to be a facilitator. It's very hands-off, and it's appealing to many people who want to go to church, get lost in the crowd, and have no questions asked. The problem with this is that it is a short-term gain and a long-term loss. And so that's the first symptom. The second symptom is easily yields to temptation. On this particular point, Thomas Boston, the Puritan, notes, "There is nothing that gives temptation more easy access than the crook in the lot, nothing more apt to occasion out-of-the-way steps." He also says, But the crook in the lot is a handle whereby the tempter makes surprising discoveries of latent corruption, even in the best. What Boston calls here the crook in the lot is what he's referring to as the afflictions and hardships of life. He writes that nothing gives temptation a stronger foothold than affliction, which means that we have to navigate affliction well. We actually have to think with our minds carefully about how we're going to navigate affliction. We can't just coast through it. Satan seeks to take advantage of any chink in the armor, and he applies his temptations more diligently, repetitively, and aggressively when one is in a position of weakness. While the world teaches us that the one who's been abused can do no wrong, Satan disagrees. Satan decided that the opportune time to tempt Christ was while he was in the wilderness fasting. He thought that in his physically weakened state, he might be more easily encouraged to sin. And so before you think that you can do no wrong as a victim, take heed lest you fall. This is the time to be enlisting the help of others who can see your blind spots and give you advice. Unfortunately, most people tend to throw off counsel when they're in this kind of trial. It's not uncommon for a traumatized person under the incantation of a trauma-informed therapist to slowly but surely, one by one, eliminate all of their former friends. No questions allowed, remember? Only affirmations. That's the second symptom. The third one is shame and guilt. Experiencing shame and guilt as a response to trauma, of course, is very common. Shame and guilt is not inherently wrong, so long as it takes us to Christ. In fact, it's actually necessary. But we do need to walk carefully through it so that we navigate it well. I found it interesting that in Van der Kolk's book, a significant portion of the stories he told of traumatized persons involved guilt to some degree. For instance, one example from the book was about a man who killed some innocent Vietnamese as revenge after some of his own men were killed in a raid. Part of his trauma is wrapped up in the guilt. For his actions against these Vietnamese to be just, he must keep the trauma alive, and so he keeps rehearsing the situation. Van der Kolk ultimately doesn't deal with the guilt, especially since he thinks it's all material anyway. Sometimes people will rehearse their trauma constantly to others, always seeking affirmation that what they did was right, always seeking affirmation that they are the victim. This is a sure sign that you are wrestling through a guilty conscience. People can feel guilt in all sorts of situations. They can feel guilt following an assault or following abuse or any number of things. A sure sign that someone does feel guilty is that they protest loudly and oftentimes emotionally against having any guilt. Sometimes people who go through trauma end up becoming activists as a way to work off past guilt. Oftentimes those who deconstruct their faith and leave Christianity follow this particular path. Sometimes former Christians are the loudest activists. One might think of the fact that those with a guilty conscience often have a hair-trigger temper, or they're always looking over their shoulders. Joseph's brothers provide us with this example from Genesis 42:21. They said to one another, "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." Most people try to suppress their guilt, which is the worst possible thing you could do. The first step is to determine whether the guilt is legitimate or not. If it is, you need forgiveness in Christ. If not, then you need to retrain your conscience with Scripture. Van der Kolk never dealt with the guilt that his patients had. At the end of the day, his view is that it is all a material thing, not a spiritual thing. But guilt does have to be dealt with, and all of us face this problem. If someone tells you that they feel guilty, you should always take that seriously and never dismiss it. If the guilt is legitimate, then they need to find satisfaction in the finished work of Christ at the cross. If the guilt is not legitimate, they need to be led through that. That's the third. The fourth one is bitterness and lack of forgiveness. The fourth symptom here is something that happens when someone has wronged us, and instead of forgiving them, like the Bible instructs us, we harbor resentment, anger, and we do not forgive them. When the trauma has to do with a relationship, for instance, a bad relationship with a parent growing up, For example, very frequently one has to be aware of the following fact, and this is crucial to understanding why this has such a strong hold in our lives. The cause of past distress was the abuse, while the cause of present distress is the lack of forgiveness or a bitter heart. If, for example, you were cut by someone yesterday with a knife, the cause of your past distress would be the cut. But if it becomes infected, the cause of your present distress is a lack of dressing the wound properly and tending to it. You, even though you were hurt, have a responsibility to take care of that cut. Hebrews 12:15 says, "See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled." Someone once said that bitterness is the poison you drink, hoping the other person will die. And because of the deceitfulness of the human heart toward itself, one might be self-deceived about whether he is bitter or not. Bitter people tend to spew their bitterness everywhere. It starts small and grows. Perhaps maybe you've seen someone like this at the place that you work or out in the community somewhere, someone who has been bitter and has not forgiven someone for decades. No longer is their bitter only directed towards that particular person. Now they are just a bitter person in general. They're bitter at everyone. They're bitter at the person at the checkout line. They're bitter at their neighbor. They're bitter at their spouse. They're always discontent, unsatisfied, bitter, angry, and resentful. And that's because they have never learned how to forgive. Nobody can do a thing about what others do to us, but we can control our responses. If you become bitter against a parent, understand that your spouse, your children, your coworkers, and your friends will become collateral damage. That's just the way of things according to Hebrews 12. It starts small and it grows. And more times than not, you are unaware of the suffering that you are putting others through. Let go of your bitterness, embrace forgiveness, and experience the joy that Christ has called you to have. Well, that's all I've got for today. Lord willing, we'll look at the next 4 symptoms next week. Thanks for listening to CrossView Radio. I'm John Marino, pastor of CrossView Church in Orville. We meet Sundays at 9 a.m. To find out more about CrossView Church, visit us online at crossvieworville.com.